Welcome, everybody. This is a special gathering here at Hopium Chronicles with an old friend who's in very different circumstances since the last time we spoke. But Amir Tibon, who's a correspondent for Haaretz, who came to us in the spring. One of our first events that we did when we began Hopium in March was a report from Israel that we got from Amir about the protests and the demonstrations and the civil uprising against the Netanyahu power grab and the effort to end Israeli democracy. It was an amazingly powerful session we had with him. And obviously since then, since the spring of 2023, dramatic events have unfolded. And so, welcome back, Amir. And I just want to start by saying, how are you? How's your family? How are you doing?
Hi, Simon. It's great to be here again. Thanks for having me. We've been through very dramatic events, my family, in the last month and a half. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but basically, a month and a half ago, on a quiet Saturday morning, 5 armed terrorists with guns and hand grenades and an RPG launcher were all circling my house, trying to break in to kill me, my wife, and my 2 young daughters. And we survived their attack on the small community where we live, which is in southern Israel, not far from the border with Gaza. But others in our community were not as fortunate. We're a community of 500 people. 14 were murdered, 5 were kidnapped into Gaza, including a 9-year-old girl and a 15-year-old girl that we have no idea what happened to them since. And we became refugees in our own country after that. All of the communities like ours that are close to the border with Gaza have been evacuated by the Israeli government. And so there are now tens of thousands of people like us who are living in all kinds of temporary residences. I'm basically sharing a room here with my wife and 2 daughters in some community in north central Israel. And I think we're okay, Simon. We're getting there day by day. The first few days were very shocking, realizing what had happened to us. We are trying to get back to life as much as possible. I'm back to work at my newspaper, Haaretz, which remains the most important source of news about what's happening in Israel and in the region these days. And we hope that the war that is currently fought in Gaza will lead eventually to some kind of a diplomatic solution that can create long-term stability and security. I don't want to talk about peace right now because it sounds so out of touch with the reality, but at some point also that. But it's not, not easy days for us as a country, as a community, and also for me and my family on a personal level.
Can you describe a little bit about, you said you're refugees in your own country. I mean, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, right, in a very small country who have been disconnected from the place they live, their livelihoods. In many cases, you're fortunate that you can keep working wherever you are, but that's not true for many people, right? And so can you talk a little bit about how your colleagues and how your friends and family are dealing with this level of disruption? Because I don't think this idea that Israel, a big chunk of Israel, has basically become uninhabitable, or at least hard to imagine how it could be inhabitable, is not, I think, well understood here in the U.S.
I'll try to explain. And again, I'm sorry there's a little, movement behind me, but we're all sharing this one small room right now. Basically, more than 150,000 Israelis have had to leave their homes in the last few weeks because of the war in the south and the threat of a war in the north of Israel, the threat of an attack by Hezbollah from Lebanon, which would be similar to what we experienced with Hamas on October 7, when they came into our communities and slaughtered families and killed children and did awful things like that. So people living in southern Israel, close to the border with Gaza, were evacuated as a result of what Hamas did. And people living in northern Israel, on the border with Lebanon, had been evacuated out of fear that Hezbollah will try to do the same. So we have more than 150,000 people who, first of all, are not home right now, and they are sleeping in all kinds of hotels and hostels and rooms that are available in different parts of the country. And you know, Simon, staying in one small hotel room for a family with 2 or 3 or 4 children, maybe it's nice for the first 2 days. After a month and a half, everybody pretty much wants to kill one another. So um, it's tough. Children, many of them are out of school for this entire period. Our community has been lucky that the community in north central Israel that has adopted us opened a kindergarten for our children after a few days. So they have kindergarten until 1 p.m. every day, which allows us, the parents, to try to work a little bit. That's not true for many other people in many other communities. My wife is not able to work. She works in special education. She's a special education social worker. She works with children on the autistic spectrum in a city in southern Israel. And everything in that city, Ashkelon, has been shut down for the month and a half that has been since the Hamas attack. So I feel bad for her that she can't work. I feel 10 times worse for the children and the parents in her, in the school that she works for, that they have nothing right now. These children are stuck at home with their parents. The parents cannot work. The children cannot learn. And it's tough for any child. It's 10 times more difficult for special ed kids. And yet this is the reality in many parts of the country right now. And I think the most difficult part is the unknown. We have no idea when we'll be able to go back. How long will the war with Hamas in Gaza go on for? What will happen in the north with Hezbollah? Will that threat even be removed? So we're looking at a possibility of living under these conditions for months until some kind of a breakthrough comes. And that is the really difficult part, the realization that it will be a long time until we can go home.
Can you talk a little bit about the threat of Hezbollah? I think that, Americans have become educated about Hamas and have greater understanding of Hamas, but in many ways, Hezbollah, which is based in southern Lebanon, just north of the Israeli border, is a far greater threat. And if you can just spend a little bit of time just helping our viewers understand that a little bit.
Yeah. What Hamas did on October 7th, they basically broke into Israel and went into civilian communities and murdered civilians. They also killed soldiers in military bases. They could have sufficed with that, but they decided deliberately to go into civilian neighborhoods like mine. And in my community, they murdered an 18-year-old girl. They murdered an 80-year-old woman. They kidnapped children. Hezbollah has the ability to inflict even more pain and suffering and death on northern Israel because it has the same, terror and kind of, extremist ideology as Hamas, but it is much more well trained. It's a larger organization. It's better funded. It's like a small military. And apart from that, Hezbollah also has a much more advanced missile arsenal than Hamas. Hamas is shooting missiles and rockets at central Israel, including Tel Aviv. Some of them even got as far north as Haifa, but most of those can be intercepted by Iron Dome. Hezbollah has the ability with its missile arsenal to overcome, to some degree, Iron Dome. It can flood the system. And how does Iron Dome work? Which is this great Israeli invention that has saved thousands of lives in Israel over the years. And by the way, it has also saved many, many lives in Gaza, because if all the rockets of Hamas would have hit the targets in Israel, the Israeli retaliation would have been so severe. I don't want to think about what would have happened in Gaza. But Iron Dome intercepts a rocket, flying in the sky. It calculates the route, it sends an interceptor, and then stops the rocket. But if Hezbollah can launch 500 missiles at the same time, Iron Dome is not going to be able to deal with that kind of amount. And the missiles and the rockets that Hezbollah has can bring down entire buildings in Tel Aviv, in Haifa. It can bring down, skyscrapers. I mean, this is a very, very difficult situation. And here I want to applaud President Biden for a second for doing everything he can to try to stop the possibility of an Israel-Hezbollah war from happening. Because the ramifications of that kind of war would have been disastrous for Israel and the entire Middle East, Lebanon, Gaza, um, as far as Iran. This would have been a different kind of war with much higher casualty numbers in Israel and all over the region. And I understand why President Biden has made such a great effort to stop it from happening.
You mentioned to me before we came on that you feel that President Biden has saved tens of thousands of lives. Can you talk a
I
little
don't
bit about
feel it.
that?
I don't feel it. I know it. I know it. If we're looking at an Israel-Hezbollah war, and then, of course, with an involvement of Iran, Israel would hit Lebanon in such a powerful way. And I believe also Iran, because Iran, at the end of the day, is the sponsor of Hezbollah. This would become an all-out war in the Middle East that could affect the lives of tens of thousands of people. It could affect the lives of millions, but it could cost the lives of tens of thousands of people. And I think President Biden, by intervening and stopping it from happening, deterring Hezbollah, deterring Iran, sending a clear message that the United States would consider getting involved on Israel's side. I think by doing that, he has saved the lives of tens of thousands of people all across the Middle East.
You had a chance to speak to the president when he visited a few weeks ago. What happened in that discussion?
So President Biden did something historic a few weeks ago. He was the first American president ever to come to Israel during a war, during an active war, land in this country under the threat of rockets and missiles from Hamas. And who knows, Hezbollah could have used the occasion that he was here maybe to try something of their own. And I think that was very brave of him. And I know he did the same thing in Ukraine last year when he went to visit Kiev. But in Kiev, he came by surprise. I think it was an unannounced visit. And here in Israel, everybody knew he was coming, and it was also a show of force. He landed here and he had political meetings, obviously, with the political leadership of this country. He also met with families of American citizens who are being held hostage by Hamas right now. Overall, there are 240 people in the hands of Hamas, and I think 10 or more have American citizenship, so he met their families. And at the very end of his trip, it was a short one-day trip, he left some time for a meeting with Israeli citizens who had been directly impacted by the war with Hamas. People who lost family members. There was a man whose daughter was murdered at the music festival that maybe you heard about, Simon. There was a big music festival in our part of Israel on that morning. Hamas came in, murdered more than 300 people, people who just wanted to go to a party. There was another man, an Arab Muslim citizen of Israel, who lost his nephew at that party. The nephew was a paramedic. His name was Awad. And he went to that party to, as a paramedic, to treat people. He perhaps thought that some people would get drunk too much and, have a headache or something, and he would help them. He found himself treating people who were wounded by Hamas, shooting at them, and eventually he was murdered himself while trying to save lives. There were people from my area of the country who had their homes attacked. And I was also invited. My story became somewhat famous, how my wife and I, for 11 hours, had to keep our daughters quiet in a dark room with no electricity, no food, no entertainment, while 5 terrorists were standing outside our door. And President Biden asked to meet us. We all thought, all the group, the 12 Israelis in the group, we all thought that he would probably shake our hand, say a nice sentence, and then, there will be a photo and he will go to Air Force One and fly back to Washington. And we were okay with that, but that's not what happened, Simon. President Biden came in and he started walking around the room, moving from, each one of us to the next. And he didn't just, shake our hand and that was it. He actually spent a lot of time listening to us, hearing our stories. He hugged people. He, let them put their head on his shoulder, and some of them cried. Especially people who lost loved ones. He really had a connection with them because of his own family history, and the tragedies that he had dealt with in his life. And so he spoke to every person for a few minutes. Then he gave a short statement to the media, and the press, all the journalists left the room, and we were sure that was it. That, he met us, he gave a statement, and we started seeing the Secret Service kind of, hinting to him that it was time to go. But the president then raised his hand and he said, "No, wait a minute. I need to speak to these people." And so he spoke very quietly. I know, Simon, there's a whole debate, in the media in the US about the president's age. And yeah, you could see, President Biden, he's an old man. He spoke in a quiet, soft voice. And so we had to huddle around him, all of us, these 12 Israelis. We stood very, very close to him. And he was standing, leaning on this kind of like, standing table. And he started speaking about grief and about pain and about loss. And I could see how his age is also an asset. He's been through so much. He's seen so much in his life. He's dealt with so many tragedies, so many difficult situations. And we just listened to him, and he spoke for about 20 minutes, maybe more, close to 30 minutes. He said, "You guys need to understand, you are never going to forget the people that you lost on this dark day." He said that he thinks about his wife and his daughter and his son that he lost every day. And the car accident where he lost his wife and daughter, it was, I think, 50 years ago. He said, "Every day I think about them. Every day I think about my son." It's been almost a decade. And you guys need to prepare for that. You need to be ready for that. And he spoke about not letting grief turn into anger and hatred. And, he brought together these two people, a Jewish Israeli citizen who had lost his daughter at the party, and the Arab Muslim citizen I told you about who lost his nephew at the same event. And he brought them together. He spoke about how grief should not be turned into hate. And he spoke about the Holocaust, how as a young child, his father would tell him stories about the camps in Europe and would say that America has a commitment to the Jewish people. And he said under his watch, something like this could never happen again. And when he left the room after about 20 something minutes, at some point the Secret Service just really got nervous, and he said, "You know what, guys, I'm the president, but I don't get to make the decisions, it turns out." And we all just stood there and we just clapped our hands for a minute as he left the room. We were so touched. And I want to say this was beyond politics. This transcended politics. There were people in that group of Israelis with different political opinions, some of them supporters of Prime Minister Netanyahu, some of them, like myself, very, very critical of the Prime Minister. If you would put, a voting booth in there for the American election, maybe some would have voted for a Republican, and some for a Democrat. But at that moment, everybody felt a very, very unique connection with President Biden because of his ability to show empathy and understand what we had gone through and help guide us toward what we're still going to live through for the rest of our lives.
Remarkable story.
And it really was remarkable.
What happens next? Where are we headed?
Difficult to predict, right? I mean, who would have thought we would even be in this situation? But I think the military operation that Israel is running in northern Gaza against Hamas has mostly been successful so far. You can see that Hamas is slowly losing its military capabilities in the northern part of Gaza. Every day, the number of rocket and missile launches toward Israel goes down a bit. In the beginning of the war, they were launching 3,000 rockets a day at Israel. Now it's in the low hundreds. Unfortunately, we are losing soldiers. I think today, as we speak, more than 10 Israeli soldiers were killed inside Gaza. And of course, there are also casualties on the Palestinian side. A lot of Hamas terrorists are dying. And also, sadly, and I'm serious about this, I'm not saying it as, like a automatic thing. It's really sad. Also, a lot of civilians are dying. This is a war in a very dense urban area where Hamas is using that terrain to run a guerrilla campaign from behind civilian institutions. This is their strategy. It's not a secret. They're using schools, they're using clinics, they're using hospitals, they're using apartment buildings. And in that kind of environment, people get hurt. It's a very difficult war, but I do think the Israeli military has been successful in this part of the campaign, in taking away Hamas's capabilities in northern Gaza. The biggest problem is that continuing into southern Gaza right now, to me, looks almost impossible. Most of the population has fled to the southern part of Gaza. There's more than 2 million people there right now. And the consequences of continuing the campaign into southern Gaza would be severe. I believe we would have many casualties and they would have many casualties, and civilians among them. And also right now, there is, with all the difficulties, there is no full-blown humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. We're not talking about a plague, God forbid, or a total collapse of the water system or things like that. If you send the military into southern Gaza, it's going to be very dangerous. So I don't know what will happen on that. From my point of view, the goal of this war is not to count bodies on the other side or to take revenge. Not at all. The goal of this war is to create a reality in which a year from today, I'm not in this little room anymore. I'm back in my home, which I just want to note, Simon, so everybody understands, my home, my community, we're not a settlement on occupied or disputed land. We are a community located within the internationally recognized borders of the state of Israel. Okay, borders that all the international community and international law respect. And so we want to go back home. And for me, victory in the war is that a year from today, I'm back home in my kibbutz Nachal Oz, and I can send my 2 young daughters to kindergarten in the morning and go off to work in the Haaretz offices in Tel Aviv with peace of mind. That's the definition of victory in the war. And how do we achieve that? I believe the military campaign is a very important part of that, but it's not going to be enough. There is also going to be a diplomatic element that has to be part of this. Just crushing Hamas's military capabilities, it's very important. Without that, nothing can be done. But alone, it is not enough. For me to go back home and a year from today, put my daughters in their kindergarten and drive off to work, there will also have to be a different government in Gaza, a different mechanism that, for how things are run over there. And that's the really difficult part. That's where we're going to need a lot of help from the United States and from other actors in the region, some of the important Arab countries, and also a different approach from our own government and from the Palestinian government. Today there is only one legitimate Palestinian government, which is the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. There's going to be a lot of difficulties. A lot of things are going to have to change. But for me, that's the goal. A year from today, to be back home and to send my daughters to their kindergarten.
Seems hard to imagine.
Yeah.
That
it's difficult.
Well, if this is all to pass, it seems hard to imagine that Israeli government could be led by Bibi Netanyahu. I mean, I don't see that him having the capacity to do what needs to be done, it seems.
Netanyahu is the worst prime minister in the history of Israel. This was true before October 7, but after October 7, there's just nobody in his league. There's just nobody in his league after October 7. I mean, he used to, have election campaign signs saying a league of his own and showing his pictures with Trump and Putin. He's in a league of his own, Simon. He is the prime minister who saw under his watch the worst massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust. This is what we're talking about here, okay? He let this country down, and he's been letting it down every day since October 7, because the government is not functioning on the economic side. It's not functioning on the education side. People like myself and my family, the internal refugees, we are counting on the amazing help and support of the civil society in Israel. Communities that have opened their doors to people like us and are finding solutions for us and hosting us. Citizens who are donating clothes. This shirt, Simon, that I'm wearing, this is not my shirt, okay? This room that I'm speaking with you, it's not my room, okay? It's important to understand this. We are relying on the generosity of our own society. The government has not been there for us. And it's not just a personal anecdote, it's true everywhere. So he resided over a complete failure on October 7, and he's been responsible for a complete collapse of the state ever since. There is a big debate in the country right now about replacing him during the war. I personally think we must replace him right now. We must do everything we can to replace him and not wait until the end of the war, because the war could drag on for a while. And if we look at some examples from history, you look at, for example, Britain during World War II, the most important thing was that at some point within the Conservative Party, there was a rebellion against Chamberlain, and Churchill replaced him, and it was a condition for the left-wing opposition, for Labour, to join the government. And I think if we had something like this in Israel, if there was, Netanyahu was replaced by someone, it doesn't have to be a Churchill, just a normal leader, Israel would be in a much better place. But let's say my opinion does not, eventually win the day, and he does remain there for, the length of the war. After it is over, there is going to be a protest movement against him in Israel that will make what we spoke about a few months ago, the protests against his judicial overhaul, it will make that look like a children's game. There's so much anger, so much disappointment, so much disillusionment in the country. And people who lost their homes and lost their families and lost their faith in the institutions of the country are never going to forgive him. And so I can tell you, people like my community are going to be leading this protest movement against him. And I don't think he will survive that. There will be a new election and someone else will take over. I don't know who, but someone different than him.
Well, and my observation about this, and I'm, is just as an American political observer, for Democrats who control the Senate, and Joe Biden, who's obviously, been so supportive of Israel, to maintain the level of domestic support here in the US required to see all this through over the next few years, having Bibi Netanyahu as the face of Israel on our domestic media and so on is very challenging for people in the Democratic Party. Bibi has been an antagonist to us. He's endorsed against one of our presidential candidates. He's dismissive of center-left politics here in Israel and everywhere. He's running and the free hand that the settlers have had has put on, extraordinary amounts of domestic pressure here. And I just, my own worry is that Joe Biden, every day that Bibi is in power, the pressure on Biden to pull back, right, it grows. And,
Of course.
it is, Bibi not only let down the people of Israel, but he antagonized the majority of the Jewish community in the United States against him and his government. It's domestically, the Democratic Party right now. I'm not as worried about the internal fissures that have been reported as many other are, because I think it's at this moment highly concentrated in a small group of Democrats. However, that could change, and depending on how not just the politics of Israel, but the conduct of the war itself, and the brutality of the war, and the images that continue to show up on social media and on our televisions here, and the tragedy that is being witnessed, right, the loss of life. And it is, I can tell you that as somebody who's been very aggressive in my backing of Joe Biden's foreign policy and during his presidency, the internal debate inside the Democratic Party is becoming very intense now. And
I follow it from here and I see it.
Yeah, and it's real, and it is, and the way I talk about it is that this is a debate worth having. What democracies do is they have debates. We don't all have to agree on everything. And Joe Biden had a terrific op-ed in the Washington Post today, which I strongly encourage. It's long. It's clear that he wrote it himself. He had a lot to say. It's incredibly well. It's very Biden-esque in its language too. It's very laconic and sparse and muscular in the way that he talks. And it is to me, I've written on my Substack that I write a lot about the need for Bibi to go for the US. I mean, Israel, you've got your own domestic politics that you
but it's our interest as well, because we want to preserve the level of support that President Biden has showed us, not just in this moment, but in the future. I don't want a future American president to ask themselves, wait a second, if I now support Israel when they're fighting a war, could it hurt me politically? Could I lose an election over it? I don't want that to be part of the discussion.
and
And I think,
and
I think
Amir,
it's,
let me just
Mhm.
say the other part of it is that the level of anti-Semitism that's exploded here in the US, and we've seen it around the world, is also unprecedented in the modern era.
Of course,
And
it's
that's
a
also
huge concern
Bibi's.
for us as well.
Yeah, and Bibi played a major role in all of this. And it is so I just, as somebody who wants all of this to go in the right direction, I just hope that the leadership of the people of Israel understand that every day that Bibi is there, that it gets harder and harder here. And because
Mhm.
Jews themselves are, I tell the story that when I was growing up, anti-Semitism in America was my grandmother, Josephine Valinsky, who emigrated to the United States from Riga, Latvia, had a professional name of Vallin, Vallin. And when she went to go buy her first home in Darien, Connecticut, when she went to sign the uh, the purchase agreement, she was denied the ability to buy the house because Jews weren't allowed to buy property in Darien, Connecticut in 1951 in the United States, right? And that was the kind of anti-Semitism that existed. You couldn't join clubs, you couldn't get into. Now, here domestically in the US, I mean, we're seeing people being killed, we're seeing violence on college campuses. I have three kids who are 18, 21, and 23, and they're entering a world of the level of anti-Semitism that they're personally going to encounter is unimaginable for many of us, right? You lived here for many years. And it's critical that as the war is conducted, that the government of Israel understand the need to create some kind of olive branch to the world here, because it is the resentment and the anger, the frustration that's growing is real. And
So I want to say something about that, Simon.
yeah,
We're never going to change the mind of the anti-Semites, okay? Anti-Semites will hate us regardless of who's the prime minister of Israel, and anything that we do to protect ourselves, they will use against us. To me, the concern is not the anti-Semites, but it's the people who are watching this and may be confused and become convinced by the anti-Semites. That is my concern. I want people who are not anti-Semitic in their core, don't hate Jews and don't hate the state of Israel. I don't want them to fall for these arguments. I don't want to make it easier for the people who hate us, and there's nothing we can do against it, right? This is the oldest hatred in the world.
yep.
Today it's because Israel is doing something in Gaza, and tomorrow it's because of something different. I don't want them to win the day. I don't want them to win hearts and minds. And this is a responsibility that we have on ourselves. And I do believe that our government is not doing a good job in that realm. On too many days, people in my own government are making it easier for the anti-Semites. Let's put it that way. Okay,
I mean,
when a minister in the government comes and says we should drop a nuclear bomb on Gaza, that is making it easier for the anti-Semites, because then you have an average person, an average news viewer in the US, a student on a college campus who sees that and said, oh, maybe it proves that these people who were demonstrating and shouting from the river to the sea a few days ago, maybe they got a point. I don't want to give those people any opening. We have to defend ourselves first and foremost. We cannot calculate our military strategy based on what other people will think about us, but we also have to think very clearly about how we communicate reality, what we say about things, when we can, to try to avoid harm to innocent people. It's very, very important. It's also an issue of Jewish morality, frankly, beyond what will be said. And I want to make it easier for President Biden, who supports us and loves us, and I want to make it more difficult for the people in the United States who hate us. This is the way I look at it. And yeah, unfortunately, this is a big criticism that I have of the government. They're not making it easier for President Biden, and on many days, they're making it easier for the anti-Semites.
Agreed. Agreed. And it is remarkably challenging times. I'm so grateful, Amir, for the time you've spent. I know it's getting late there, and your kids probably have to go to sleep soon. But any final parting words for us and here in the United States? I mean, any final thoughts for us today?
I can tell you that there is going to be a big struggle here in Israel after we win this war. I mean, it may begin even during the war, but certainly after it's over, to replace the leadership of this country. Leadership is a bad word because today we don't have a leadership. We have a failed, corrupt prime minister who has brought this country to a disaster, and we want real leadership. And I think it's really important for people in the US who support liberal values and support, democracy and human rights, to pay attention to what's happening here and to understand what many Israelis are fighting for right now. Because if we cannot defeat the evil of Hamas after what they did on October 7, it is only going to play into the hands of the far right in this country. So it's a very, very difficult situation. But we first of all have to win this war. That's the most important thing after what Hamas did on October 7, murdering families, killing children, raping women, just awful, barbaric things. And then we're also going to have to struggle for the face of our country. And I think at the end of the day, it's also important on a global level. We spoke about this a few months ago, Simon.
Yep.
What happens in Israel, what happens in Ukraine, these events will have an impact also on democracy in other parts of the world. And I think what President Biden is doing at the end of the day, he's just like he's supporting Ukraine and now he's supporting Israel, he's fighting for some very, very important principles and the core values of liberal democracy in the world. We have a lot of work ahead of us as well. We have to become a better country. We owe it to our children. And I know that we have partners in the United States that share our values, and we'll have to work together through this period.
Well, let me make two closing comments to my audience. One is I'm an enthusiastic subscriber to Haaretz in English, which I encourage all of you to do. It's a way to support Israel and support a remarkable Israeli institution that is, in a time of enormous crisis. I find the reporting there, it's my go-to source every morning. And so just encourage everyone to, it's not too expensive. They've made it cheap for you to become a subscriber. And the second thing I just want to say is that, I began, part of the reason I asked Amir that Amir joined us back in the spring is that I started Hopium in this new journey I'm on back in the spring because I felt that American elites really didn't understand the nature of the conflict that we have found ourselves in, that we were living a period, we were leaving a period of relative peace and prosperity and entering a period where there would be more direct conflict. And it was, I just felt that among my brothers and sisters and the people that run this town in Washington, there was really, I think, a lack of understanding of the gravity of the opposition that had been growing to the American-led global order. And it wasn't just Russia, right? And thankfully, we had a great APEC summit in this last week, and China, at least, publicly seemed to be in a far more productive and constructive place. But this is going to be this conflict, as I call it, again, of the West and our modern values against those that are trying to bring down the West and to weaken this global liberal order, is really the defining, there are two, in my view, defining battles of this time is going to be this one and climate change. And that what's important about what's happening, I think, Amir, the good news is that in the United States, we're now having this conversation. We needed to have this conversation. I mean, what was happening in Ukraine was very far away. It was very distant. It seemed like something happening to other people. This has brought this conflict that I described into our lives in ways that it needed to happen. And we need to go through the process of it, as any democracy would, of debating these things, coming to a greater understanding, having these debates that sometimes become difficult and hard and sometimes are constructive and peaceful. But we're now having one of the most important, we're at the very early stages in the United States, in my view, of what will be one of the most consequential debates that we'll have as a country in decades. And we're only in the very early stages. And so I'm very grateful to have you now twice to join us to share your views, very thoughtful, very measured, very careful views about what's happening, because we really are in all this together. We're in this together. We're all in this together. And, you know, the US, we have to wake up a bit, in my view, about the nature of what we're up against. And I think the president's op-ed today that he dropped in the Washington Post was another important moment in the articulation of this from an American sort of standpoint about connecting the battle in Ukraine to the battle in Gaza right now, and how and making this through line through this. And it's important, I think, the president start being much more aggressive about talking to the American people about what we have to do now, right, and what our obligations are. And speaking to my fellow Democrats, I'll just conclude by saying, you know, our party was called once before in the 1940s to defend freedom and democracy, you know, here and everywhere. And in many ways, we're being called again. And what's been inspiring to me is the way the American people have responded. But we're at the very early stages of what is a new era, I think, of global and domestic U.S. politics. And certainly part of what I hope we can do in the Hopium community is be thoughtful leaders of this conversation that needs to happen, which is desperately needing to happen. It's going to be dark. It's going to be scary. There's going to be difficult days ahead. But this is what we have to do. And so, Amir, thank you. God bless your family and to, you know, your kids, and just stay in touch with us, and just, you know, sending enormous amounts of love here from Northwest DC to you and your family. And please let us know if there's anything else we can do in addition to subscribing to Haaretz, which is very important. Thanks, everybody.
Simon.
Take care.
Always good to talk to you, my friend. Goodbye.
Okay, bye-bye.